Why power stopped moving first. It didn't lose influence. It didn't fall behind overnight. Power was still recognized, respected, and feared in the right rooms. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being first, and no one noticed when leadership quietly became reaction. This matters today because power is often measured by scale and authority. But real power is measured by initiative. The moment leaders wait to see what happens before acting, power hasn't disappeared. It has changed direction. The billionaire at the center of this story commanded enormous influence. Markets watched their moves. Competitors adjusted strategies in response. When the empire acted, consequences followed. That position had been earned through years of decisive leadership. The reveal began with caution. As the empire grew larger, decisions carried greater weight. Every move affected more people, more capital, more reputation. Acting first now meant absorbing more risk. Waiting felt responsible. Observation felt prudent. Let others move, then respond intelligently. And that approach worked. At first, the billionaire noticed that reacting still produced strong outcomes. Others took early risks. The empire refined what worked and scaled it better. Power felt intact because results followed. There was no obvious penalty for waiting. But power behaves differently when it leads versus when it responds. The shift happened quietly. Strategic conversations began with analysis of competitors rather than intention. Plans were framed around positioning instead of direction. The empire waited for signals, then optimized its response. Being second felt smart. The reveal deepened as the organization grew excellent at timing reactions. Moves were calculated, risks minimized, mistakes avoided. Power looked disciplined, controlled, and sophisticated. But something subtle changed. The empire was no longer shaping the field. It was adjusting to it. The billionaire felt it emotionally before naming it. Decisions felt safer, but less defining. Wins felt narrower. Influence followed events instead of creating them. Power still mattered, but it no longer surprised anyone. The first external signal appeared when smaller players began setting narratives. They moved early, imperfectly, and publicly. The empire responded well, but after the fact, authority remained, but initiative had shifted. Power had stopped moving first, not because it was weak, but because it had become careful. And careful power doesn't disappear. It waits. The conflict was beginning to form, not between strength and failure, but between leadership and reaction. Because when power stops initiating change, it doesn't vanish. It teaches the future to happen somewhere else first. The habit of waiting settled in without resistance. Observation became process. Analysis became comfort. The organization learned how to respond expertly and slowly forgot how to initiate without external prompts. The reveal continued as decision-making shifted tone. Instead of asking, "What should we do next?" leaders asked, "What is everyone else doing?" Strategy decks opened with market reactions, not intent. Moves were framed as responses rather than declarations. Power became adaptive instead of directive. The billionaire saw this as evolution. Why move first when others can absorb the early risk? Why experiment publicly when lessons can be learned privately? Power felt efficient this way. But efficiency carries a hidden trade. It removes surprise. The conflict sharpened when the empire began losing narrative control, not market share narrative. Others framed the conversation. Others defined what mattered. The empire entered later, with better execution but weaker authorship. The billionaire felt the shift clearly. Being right was no longer enough. Being first had mattered more than anyone admitted. The reveal deepened as internal teams grew cautious about initiating bold moves. Proposals were timed around competitor actions. Ideas waited for confirmation that the market was ready. No one wanted to act prematurely, and no one wanted to be wrong publicly. Power had become conservative. The emotional tension surfaced when a rival announced a move the empire had considered internally for years. The analysis had existed. The capability was there. The only thing missing had been permission to go first. The room fell quiet. Power had not been lacking. It had been paused. The conflict was no longer about strategy. It was about posture. Waiting had become default. Initiative felt risky. And the longer power waited, the more the future formed elsewhere, without its voice shaping it. The billionaire recognized the uncomfortable truth. Power that does not move first eventually forgets how. And when it finally does move, it follows paths others have already carved. The next step would require reclaiming initiative, not through force, but through willingness to act without certainty again. Because power doesn't fade by losing strength. It fades by losing the habit of leading. The conflict reached its peak when power finally felt the cost of waiting. A shift unfolded that the empire could not optimize its way through. By the time analysis concluded, the moment had already passed. Others had acted. Others had defined the terms. The billionaire felt it during a high-level review meant to assess positioning. The numbers were fine. The response plan solid. But the outcome felt diminished. The empire was entering a future already shaped by someone else's decisions. The emotional peak arrived with a quiet realization. Power had become excellent at response. But relevance was being claimed elsewhere. The organization had learned to avoid being wrong, and in doing so, avoided being first. Initiative had been replaced by timing, leadership by calibration. Power waited for proof instead of creating it. The conflict deepened when internal data confirmed the pattern. The empire's best moves now followed external triggers. Every bold decision could be traced back to someone else acting earlier. Power still influenced outcomes, but rarely originated them. The billionaire saw the pattern clearly now. Waiting had not reduced risk. It had shifted it. By letting others move first, the empire accepted the risk of irrelevance. It traded uncertainty for dependence, and dependence quietly erodes authority. The realization carried weight. Power that reacts becomes predictable. Predictable power becomes manageable. Manageable power stops shaping the future. The empire had not lost capability. It had lost posture. Acting first had begun to feel irresponsible. But responsibility without initiative had turned leadership into maintenance. The conflict was no longer about whether the empire could lead. It was about whether it still remembered how. Leading first requires tolerance for being early, for being imperfect, for being exposed. Those muscles had weakened through disuse. The billionaire understood what was at stake. If power continued waiting for certainty, the future would continue forming elsewhere, not by opposing the empire, but by ignoring it until response was the only option left. The next move would not be about speed or aggression. It would be about reclaiming the right to define direction again, before power forgot entirely what it felt like to move first. The climax arrived when the billionaire chose to move without waiting for permission, from data, from consensus, or from precedent. Power would no longer wait to see what happened next. It would decide what happened next. The shift was visible. The empire announced an initiative before the market asked for it. Not fully polished, not perfectly modeled, but intentional. Direction was stated clearly, without comparison to competitors or justification through reaction. The response was immediate. Some questioned the timing. Others doubted the readiness. But attention returned. Power was moving first again. The resolution unfolded through authorship. The empire stopped optimizing narratives written by others and began writing its own. Moves didn't always succeed, but they set context. They forced others to respond. Initiative restored asymmetry. Internally, something reawakened. Teams felt permission to act. Ideas surfaced earlier. Decisions no longer waited for external validation. Power regained momentum not through dominance, but through declaration. The billionaire reflected on the lesson with clarity earned through restraint. Power is not measured by how well you respond. It is measured by what you cause others to respond to. By choosing initiative over caution, the empire reclaimed leadership posture. It accepted exposure as the price of relevance. Waiting stopped being the default. Movement became identity again. Because the moment power stops moving first, it teaches the world to move without it. And when power remembers how to lead, not react, the future once again has to take notice. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. Why